Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're talking about the film Miracle of the White Stallions, which came out in 1963. It was directed by Arthur Hiller and written by Alois Podolsky and A.J. Carruthers. It's based on the memoir The Dancing White Horses of Vienna by Alois Podolsky, and the film depicts the true story of the rescue of the Lipizzaner horses of the Vienna Spanish riding school at the close of World War II. It's available to watch on YouTube. We did a little additional reading for this as well. I read The Perfect Horse, The Daring U.S. Mission to Rescue the Priceless Stallions Kidnapped by the Nazis by Elizabeth Letts, and Ghost Riders, When U.S. and the German Soldiers Fought Together to Save the World's Most Beautiful Horses in the Last Days of World War II by British historian Mark Felton. And we also have a guest today, our friend Alora, who is also a big history buff and I would say a pretty big horse person. So welcome to the podcast, Alora.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right. So let's talk about our initial impressions of the movie. And maybe, Alora, you can also tell us a little bit about your relationship with this movie because you were the one to recommend it to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So this came out in the 60s when Disney sort of hit their live action gold mine era. You had big success movies coming out like Mary Poppins, The Swiss Family Robinson, The Parent Trap. They were kind of getting away from that McCarthyism, and it's a little less, all American kind of base and more like family geared. Everything was rated G, which is why I was allowed to watch it. And as a horse crazy young girl, there weren't too many options. That was sort of before they started releasing all of these horse girl movies. There was kind of a limited, like, variations of Black Beauty, but this was one. And as a mother who was staunchly G rated, hitting that sweet spot of a Disney movie about horses made this VHS one of the most played in my household. And so as a child, I didn't really understand too much of the nuance of the war theme about it, because kids are just like shiny ponies. It was really wonderful to spark a sense of imagination revolve around these horses, which I think Hiller's this was his only Disney picture, and, he later got famous with the 1970 Love Story, which is quite a different track from this one, so this was almost like he was getting his feet wet. But I think ultimately what makes this movie, which, you could argue the acting by screen great Robert Taylor is a little bit wooden, as he's wont to be, but I think Hiller kinda used the Lipizzaners as a special effect in themselves, you know what I mean? Like, he used them so sparingly that there was a lot of lead up to them, so when they were revealed, it was just a big deal, and they were just shiny, magical unicorn horses, who are solid white doing these ballet moves, and so you don't really understand what's going on unless you're sorta entranced in what goes into the heirs above ground training, which, a handful of people are, but you get this sense of wonder from it, and I think that was spectacularly done in a movie that maybe the script was suffering from a little bit. So I watched this movie on repeat, I'd say probably once a week. Like, it was a lot, just anything to get the horse.
I have a question for you. Did your enjoyment of it change through the years once you started realizing the World War II aspects of it?
Yeah, quite drastically. Started to get a little bit more jaded about the filmmaking of it. It wasn't just about shiny ponies. I realized how sorta dry the script was, but it was sort of funny to realize how, caricature-like the American soldiers sorta became, like, the Texas accents are very thick, maybe unnecessary, but it was sort of a nice contrast to Robert Taylor's sort of "must save these stallions," like, really intense, mission-focused drive where, like, his whole life is the Spanish riding school, and you have to save these stallions or he'll die, basically, like, super high stakes for him. So it was kind of funny to me when they brought in like, paying more attention to the World War II soldiers coming in and just being, like, hardcore caricatures of American cowboys, which I'm not sure that was done unintentionally, like, I feel like they may have been playing up how this whole mission was labeled Operation Cowboy, so they're like, "Let's literally bring in cowboys." When none of these men were probably from Texas, you know what I mean? But all Americans in media, especially back then, if you weren't that mid-Atlantic accent, which was no accent at all, you were heavily Texan. I started to do a little more research on it just because the history behind the horses is so interesting. The Spanish riding school and classical dressage, which is what they teach there, has its basis in military. Dressage actually, it's a rough translation of a type of training. It means training in French. And all of the moves these horses are doing are cavalry moves. They stemmed from the natural movement of horses in the wild. They collect themselves, they get very light on their feet in order to lash out and defend their territory and fight other stallions. And in the Renaissance period, you sort of saw this emergence of retraining the war mounts instead of doing more charging moves where you're just sort of plowing over the opposing army. You would train your war mounts to be more light on their feet so that they could do more evasive maneuvers. That also allowed knights to lighten up on their armor because they didn't have to wear such defensive protection if their horse was dodging blows. And so then it sort of stemmed into this art form, and it got in with the royal families of Europe. The more highly dressage trained your war mount was, the better the bloodlines, the higher social status you had. And so it became a thing of the kings and queens of Europe to breed these horses. So that was always really fascinating to me when I was getting older, paying more attention to the tie to World War II of the story, that the horses themselves come from a military background. And I don't think very many people know that.
I think the context of the movie is more interesting than the movie itself. Just the idea that this was an era where the Americans were effectively disbanding their cavalry units, and meanwhile, the Germans and the Russians were still using quite a lot of horses, and, so just kind of this era of flux and, like, all of this was changing. And also the idea that, we talked about the Monuments Men a little while ago, this idea that the Germans wanted to be able to kind of collect and own art, but they didn't really understand, like, what made it good in a lot of instances. And also this whole thing where the Germans were trying to breed the perfect human, and they were also trying to breed the perfect horse. So this kind of feeds into all this super interesting historical stuff happening around it. And the movie's definitely a kids movie, and they definitely were like, kids are gonna love these horses. I mean, the last like 10 minutes of the movie is just you're just watching the horses do a routine, which is cool, but it's not really part of the plot or anything like that. So yeah, Mart, what did you think of this movie?
I thought it was kind of boring as a movie. What I liked about it is these horses as a almost a symbol of innocence and grace and pride in a world that was obviously so devoid of grace and innocence. So I liked that about it. But I thought the movie itself, I was kind of bored, and I thought it was a bit long and a bit repetitive. But every time the horses came on, I was like, yay, horses! So I guess, I don't know, I didn't really like it as a movie, but looking back on it, every time they did a routine, I saw such pride in that portrayal that I felt almost a little bit emotional, especially when they do a presentation for Patton at some point. I was like, that was kind of emotional to me for some reason because it felt like such a victory. So, mixed feelings about it. I don't think I will necessarily watch it again, but it's a different perspective that I enjoyed and one I'd never heard about. So, I'm always keen to learn something new, and I was glad I did.
I agree. I mean, as an adult, I would give this maybe 2 out of 5 stars. But what I think is so good is the story, which, Disney did cut down on some of the difficulty of moving these horses out of the Czechoslovakian stud where the prisoners of war were, because, they can't show a lot of violence in a 1960s Disney movie. And some part of me would kinda like to see it redone, with maybe the drama of the escape embellished and maybe less about Pulaski himself, who was vital, don't get me wrong, he is the reason, the American soldiers are often credited with the very existence of the Lipizzan breed right now. This was their third facing possible extinction, and the fact that we still have these, World War II bloodlines remaining in the world today are often credited to this operation, which is, miraculous. But I just can't help but wonder if it was redone, with some of the really great war drama directors, like, sort of more in the style of, like, 1917, something like that, where you're really playing up how much they're actually facing, maybe talking about, like, the disillusionment of not just, Petoskey and the riding school and, like, how this has gone on too long, and, the Austrian people really did sort of center around the riding school as a symbol of hope, like, that was a good point, like, they valued these horses as sort of a national treasure, but, like, let's talk more about, like, the German soldiers that were ready to surrender, and they were so tired of the fighting and the destruction that, like, think about what it was like for them to see these unicorns, basically, in the middle of all this death and destruction. Here we are, 2 months away from the German surrender, like, I would like to see it redone with a rewritten script focusing on that sort of stuff, you know what I mean? I think it would be enticing if they could fix what this script was lacking.
Yeah, I agree. I think this story is really compelling. It's been 60 years since they did it last. At the time it was made, people would have had probably more context for World War II. So I feel like if they redid it now, it would be kind of nice and fresh. Like, I agree. I would watch that movie.
Me too. And before we get into the plot, I just want to say that it's kind of interesting because we see horses so symbolically in other movies and TV shows about World War II. And it's nice to see an actual movie about actual horses instead of
Mhm.
them having to be this really kind of mythical creature. So that was interesting for sure. Like we've talked about the white horse and what did we talk about? Was it Fury that had a white horse?
Yeah, Fury
Yeah.
had a white horse and, what's his name?
Masters?
Yeah, Masters of the Air. And when they asked David Ayer about the symbolism of the horse, he just emitted such a garble of word salad. I'm like, "You don't know what that white horse means. You just put it in there."
It's pretty.
Yeah.
So let's get into the plot.
We open on an idyllic scene in Austria in early 1945. It's probably deceptively calm, wherein a narrator explains the history of the Spanish riding school, which is the oldest riding school in the world. We're introduced to main character Colonel Alois Podolsky, played by Robert Taylor, and he's facing off against an SS Brigadeführer striker, played by Charles Renier, who refuses to allow Podolsky to evacuate his remaining priceless stallions from Vienna. Podolsky's already in hot water because he initially sent a large number of horses to safety in Czechoslovakia, keeping only 70 stallions at the school in Vienna. So they're like, don't fuck around. We want you to keep the remaining horses here because if you let them leave the city, then everyone's going to think that it's over. That, if the horses are going, then why are the people staying?
Right, that was true. I'm glad they sorta highlighted the fact that the best way to keep a captured population contained is to keep their morale up, and the Germans knew that by moving the Lipizzans out of the riding school, it may have been the straw that broke the camel's back for the Austrian people, and they would have been dealing with some serious uprisings. I can't even think of an American example, which I know you gals aren't American, but I can't think of an American example that highlights the national pride these horses represented to the Austrian people. Maybe, like, if they wiped out the last population of bald eagles or something, like, like there was 30 bald eagles, and if you wipe them out, America will be in chaos. I don't know, something along those lines. It was a big deal to the Austrian people.
Yeah, no, for sure. Do you wanna tell us a little bit about the history of the actual riding school?
Sure. Believe it or not, it's called the Spanish Riding School, not because it has anything to do with Spain, but originally the horses, the precursor to the Lipizzan breed, were Spanish based. Everybody's seen them, the Andalusian horses. They're always in movies. In fact, my husband hates watching movies with me because I'll point out, historical inaccuracies. Like, they wouldn't have had an Andalusian, not an Andalusian. That's not an He's like, "Okay, we get it." Like, the history of horse breeds, but they were Spanish bred. And so it's not the Spanish riding school, it's the Spanish horse riding school, basically. And like I said, these were cavalry horses. They started as a utilization of cavalry movements that slowly became more into an art form that was indicative of your aristocratic status. And then slowly, Vienna, the Spanish riding school in Vienna is the oldest one in the world, and it became sort of their country's heirloom. And they only performed for the cream of the crop, the monarchs of Europe and stuff like that. So not very many people had access to these horses, but they, if you were local, you knew about them. And so they were sort of a hidden gem. And I will say, good thing that this movie did was it sorta brought global exposure to the Lipizzans, which I don't think very many outside of this, not very many people knew about, especially at least not on the American front until this was released in American theaters. And, this movie actually spawned a global tour where they started to go around and, the reason I got to see them as a child, and Sam, I think you said your mom got to see them, was because of this movie. They actually started a tour of this movie, and they started to take some of the stallions around and do performances, which, sort of further elevated just the exposure of the breed.
People have a sense of World War I as being the last of the great cavalry wars, but the German army used 2.75 million horses in World War II. I mean, at the end of the war, when they were out of fuel, they literally had horses pulling jeeps, tanks, you name it. And this was actually double the number of horses that they used in World War I. And over 60% of them ended up as casualties. And one of the key reasons for the German Reich's interest in high end horses was that they wanted to be able to mass produce the perfect war horse. And, we talked a little bit about the Lebensborn program on our ex-company episodes about how they also wanted to breed the perfect human. It was this whole idea that they had around the purity of the bloodlines and all this kind of stuff. And so in real life, the horses that had been sent to Czechoslovakia from the Spanish riding school had actually been forcibly removed by the Third Reich's breeding program. And they brought them there and they were like, yeah, we're going to basically do experiments and see what we get.
Well, and another horrifying thing about, the reason the Lipizzans were targeted is because they are always white. It's very rare that a Lipizzan horse is born a different color. They're always born dark, but they all turn gray as they age. So he was literally trying to breed an Aryan horse race.
Yeah, that's crazy. I didn't actually know about the fact that they were always born dark and then turned white as they aged. And I just want to say about the opening scene. It starts with an overture for the music, and you get to watch these horses in freedom for about 5 minutes. It's such a Disney
So just
old-timey it's so Disney and so old-timey movie opening. And I almost wonder, I don't know if any of you have seen Spirit, the movie, the animated movie about the horse?
Stallion of the Cimarron? Yes.
Yes! And
yeah.
I feel like there's a similar overture scene in that. And I wonder if it's emulated from this movie.
I mean, it made sense, rope them in fast. Maybe they knew the script wasn't super solid, so they're like, "Show the shiny ponies, get them roped in the first 5 minutes."
I do miss movies having a big overture at the beginning. It's like easing you slowly into it. You can go grab a drink and get your popcorn, and you don't have to pay that much attention.
Well, it seems like they used to put a lot of effort into the opening credits, like I think about the Gone with the Wind opening credits, which are easily 10 minutes long. But have you guys
Yeah,
seen that? That they show all
yeah.
the, plantation scenes and horses grazing and baby, cows or whatever to make it real pastoral, so I guess you, feel worse when this world is bombed or something, I don't know. I mean, it makes sense, I guess, they literally do try to get you to have an emotional connection with this world right off the bat, but, yeah, I sort of appreciated how much effort they used to put into intro credits.
Yeah. I did feel a little bit jarred by the fact that obviously these are meant to be Germans and Austrians, and to have them in like a full German and Austrian uniform and then speak so American, kind of, I had to like blink a couple times and be like, oh, wait, of course, they are meant to be German and Austrian, not American.
It makes me wonder if we were to reshoot this movie and actually get, an Austrian or German actor in there to play Petoskey, I think this is Robert Taylor's fault. Robert Taylor was, after this, he got real big in the American Western scene, so he actually did do his own writing for this movie. It makes me wonder if that was one of the sole reasons he was cast, is maybe they couldn't find anybody else who was already a pretty avid horseman, so they didn't have to train somebody to do the writing because he's just bless his heart, he tries real hard with the intensity, but he would not have been my first pick as a leading man, you know?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
A number of Podolsky's staff are being sent to the front, which Podolsky's not very happy about. And at a farewell dinner attended by Podolsky and his wife is called Ferdina, she's played by Lily Palmer. There's an air raid on the city itself, and Podolsky once again asks Stryker to move the riding school to safety, but Stryker's like, "No, we have to stay here."
Yeah, there's a whole, sort of a bureaucratic nightmare because the Spanish riding school was placed under effective control of the military, and so the arm of the Wehrmacht that they were under was like, "Yeah, if you need to save the horses, you have permission to take them out of the city, but you also need to get permission from the local Nazi officials," and that's who Stryker is. He's the one who's like, "No, you can't be taking these horses out because it's gonna be terrible for civilian morale," and he's just like, "Okay, well, not helpful."
I thought it was interesting that during the beginning of the movie, Vienna is like this untouched by the war, at least in the eyes of the Nazis. They're like, nothing's gonna happen in Vienna, we're all safe. Like, the war's not gonna come here. And then as the movie progresses, it just gets worse and worse and worse, and it's just obviously it's gonna be the end of the war. But it's like this safe haven still for the Germans, they think. And then obviously I wonder if they did know that it wasn't quite as safe as they're making it out to be. But I thought it was interesting that the city was this untouched thing.
The timing is weird too because I think the first time the Allies really bombed the shit out of Vienna in the common parlance was like March of 1944, and then the evacuation of the horses doesn't happen until like January of 1945, and the movie kind of makes it seem like the two events fall close together. So Podesky and his friend General Telheim, played by Kurt Jurgens, hatch a plan to sneak the horses out of Vienna. They have an old order that says they can evacuate art treasures, quote unquote, to protect them from the bombing. So they're like, cool, we'll use that to evacuate horses. On their way out of town, the Podeskys run into several problems, including a military checkpoint and bombing damage to the train line. Their train even gets attacked by Allied planes. But at each point, helpful Austrians go out of their way to assist them because, these horses are very culturally important. And in real life, it was similar to this, but a little less sneaky. So in early 1945, Pulaski made the case to the local Nazi official to move precious artifacts from the school. And he sort of snuck in a secondary request where he's like, hey, if I happen to have extra space on the trucks, then is it cool if I move some horses to Upper Austria for safekeeping? And he's like, it would just help me relieve overcrowding in the stables, but by no means are we moving all of the horses. And so he got that permission. So by late February, he managed to move all of the horses except 15 stallions to safety and just in small groups here and there in these trucks.
I did enjoy the scenes on the train with the conductor, I guess. As they're being bombed at the station, this guy's like, we have to move out. And then at first they leave them behind, but he keeps coming back to then save the horses, which I enjoyed.
That seems to be pretty true to life as well. In the book I was reading, they talked about how people kind of went out of their way to be helpful in getting the horses to safety.
Which, I mean, that's one of the most endearing things about the film, I think, is that they do highlight not just these Austrian citizens, but later, the Germans and the prisoners of war even who participated in the roundup to try to move the horses out of the Czechoslovakian camp. I mean, these people really were they were enamored, as soon as they saw these creatures. It was a bright spot, something beautiful and all the bullshit they've endured so far, and you can't help but wanna be part of it? So I think that was true, from everything I've read, that it wasn't just the people directly involved, it was just everyday citizens, everyday soldiers who fell in love, on first sight with these animals.
I know it's a Disney movie, so I understand why there's not a lot of political background, but I kind of would have liked, and obviously if this ever gets remade, I think we will see it a little bit more, but obviously Austria had to face the Anschluss, and there's nothing about this in the movie whatsoever, and I would have liked to just to have understood from the movie a little bit more about the political tendencies of the Austrians versus the Germans, because there's obviously a part of them that were fine with the Anschluss, and then there was a whole big part of them who were like, fuck the Germans, we don't want to be part of Germany. So I would have liked to have seen that tension a little bit more, maybe. But it is a Disney movie, so I understand that it's not in there.
Yeah, you really gotta have your good guys and your bad guys really hammered out in a Disney movie.
Once you reach the safety in St. Martin's, the Podolskis stay at the House of Countess Arco Valley, played by Brigitte Horney. She's also housing hundreds of refugees, which is a bit of a conflict in this movie. Like, they provide some necessary tension, I think.
that was true. There were a lot of, I think they said something, maybe, what was it, 250 refugees in the area or something, and they were quite violent, and it wasn't so much that they were trying to steal the horses, they were trying to steal the tack, which was handcrafted. Every saddle is handcrafted for each individual horse. It's a lot of money, again, these were the horses of kings and queens, and so they were having to defend, not the horses being stolen necessarily, although there was some fear of them being stolen and used for food, because these people were starving. But, everything they had brought with them, all the leather goods and the uniforms and stuff like that were basically getting stolen on the day, like, on the daily. But I think it feels like an after fact in the movie, like, I think you're right, they don't play up the socio-political tension enough to where this makes a lot of sense. It feels like just a drive-by, "Hey, these people are trying to steal the horses," like, who are these? Like, we kinda sorta know they're refugees, but I think it was just a throwaway line where they explained who these people are. So it just seems like the writing school is just being roughed up for no reason at all.
It also just makes it unclear, like, if you don't know about the political tendencies of Austria in general, you don't really know on whose side they're on. Like, are these good guys? Are these bad guys? They feel like bad guys a little bit because they're attacking the riding school, but they are also just refugees trying to escape being arrested by the Germans.
Well, I don't think putting them in, like, hobo costumes was enough to delineate, like, you know what I mean? They're like, "Make them look ratty and dirty." That's how you know they're the bad guys, like, okay.
Yeah, and watching the movie too, like, of course, like, I understood they were refugees, but there was just very like you said, very little context given, and, I mean, we're getting to the end of World War II where, like, literally tens of millions of people were displaced, some of whom were displaced for years at a time, and, so these people, I don't know that at this point their political views are one way or the other. I think they're just trying to, find enough food to survive and wait out the war and hopefully be able to go home at some point.
Right.
They didn't really give Podarsky very much outward political opinion. Like, obviously, he cares about his writing school, and that's what they focus on. But if this were like an adult movie instead of a children's movie, it would have been a very different movie.
Well, to my understanding, he was a pretty staunch, monarchist. He was a cavalry officer, for the Austrian army, and he went to the Olympics for them in, 26, I think, and so he was not happy at all about being under Nazi occupation and forced to serve as a cavalry officer, which one of the problems I wondered about in the movie is, would he have actually worn an SS uniform? I don't think he would have. What do you think, Sam, from reading his book? What kind of vibes did you get?
I think he did wear, like, a Wehrmacht uniform because I think he had to, but he was pretty quick to like, as soon as they knew the Americans were coming, he was like, "We're all taking the uniforms off. We're all getting rid of we're all getting rid of these." Pretty much, as long as he was part of the Wehrmacht, I think he had a sense of like, "Well, my horses will be more or less safe. Like, they'll have food, like, they'll let me, like, keep enough guys to, like, take care of them," and that kinda stuff. So I think it was really just, like, a marriage of convenience for him, and then, yeah, as soon as he could, he was like, I'm getting the fuck out of here."
Right. Yes, it would have been better that he was cooperative to maintain some level of power over the situation, like, well, if I have to work with the devil, at least put myself in a position of some importance to where he could actually do what had to be done. But
Yeah.
I think he would probably have been really pissed.
Yeah. Yeah, he definitely was a guy who was like, "Priority is the horses, so if this is what I gotta do to make sure that nobody fucks with the horses, then this is what I gotta do."
Right.
In the movie, it just felt kind of opportunist to me, but that's because the horses are so centered, and I missed kind of his motivations a little beside the horses, which obviously, if you read the book, I'm sure there's a little bit more on it. And again, it's a Disney movie, so I'll stop whining about it now, but it would have been so interesting to feel that political tension in there.
You're just supposed to understand that he's a horse guy. He's a
Right.
horse
I think you should whine about it a little bit, though. What are we doing here? If not, listen, I think we should write Disney and be like, "Guys, you had a great starter here. We've got some ideas to how to improve it on the next round."
That's right. We've written a suggested screenplay.
Right.
Take it or leave it.
If you wanted to rope in Peter Jackson, that would be great.
Yeah. Telheim shows up in their little, safe haven in Upper Austria, but it's not a social visit. He tells Pulaski that Vienna will shortly fall, and he tells him a story about a Hungarian riding school that was captured by the Russians, and they killed all of the horses. And now desperate, some of the refugees that have been hanging around attempt to steal some horses as well, so everything's kind of crumbling around him.
I enjoyed the piano scene with him, where, again, music is such an interesting thing in war movies, where obviously a lot of it at this point was forbidden by the Germans, and I did like him playing a little bit of forbidden music as a sign of rebellion.
Yeah, I think he was a great character that quite frankly didn't get enough screen time. I thought he was a lot more interesting than Robert Taylor's portrayal of Pulaski, which is not fair because Pulaski is a very interesting man in real life. Again, Robert Taylor sucks. But this is a man who he knows his days are numbered. He knows he's probably not going to make it out of this. It's very obvious that he's just trying to, do one last thing to where he can feel right in his own skin and his own soul before it all kinda goes to hell. I would've much preferred him to have a larger, presence because I thought he was way more interesting than the main characters.
Here's an instance where we actually do get some of that political tension that Mart was talking about. And Telheim is based on a real person. He was General Erich Weingarts, and he was chief of riding and driving in the German Army's High Command. And he was the one I was talking about who had initially given Podolsky the military's permission to evacuate the stallions from Vienna, but he, of course, initially couldn't get the local Nazi officials to agree. And Weingart, as we see in the film, did tell Podolsky that he would have the Spanish riding school removed from army command and returned to civilian control the way it had been before the war, because he was hoping that this would provide some measure of safety to the horses and their carers. And he called this the last good deed of my life in a letter and died by suicide days later as the regime was falling. So a little bit poignant there for sure.
See, show that. In the remake we're talking about, obviously not in the Disney movie, they can't show that, but, hit us with that emotional punch of the direct correlation of how these decisions affected the people involved in this mission? That's
Yeah.
what I want to see.
Fadina tries to cheer up her husband as the Americans draw closer, and they can hear like the artillery and the guns. Podolsky receives last minute orders to make himself the area commander of the militia, but he sees the writing on the wall at this point, and he doesn't order his men to fight. And this is when he takes off like his uniform and tells everybody else to get out of their uniforms. And when the Americans come to make the Countess his home, their new HQ, Podolsky and his men have changed out of their uniforms, so when the Americans come, they look like civilians.
Yeah, I was reading in the book that, they all took off their uniforms and kind of, like, stashed them in one of the rooms in this massive house, and then the Americans decided they wanted to use that room as, like, I don't know, like a mess or something, like a room that a lot of people would be in all the time, and so Podolsky was like, "Oh, shit," and he, like, books it to that room, and he realizes that his wife has already stashed the uniforms in, like, a big laundry basket that she was carrying and has already, like, frittered them away.
Which again, that would have been a great opportunity to flesh out her character because I think let me pull her. I think she's great. I think her role was kinda I don't wanna say not necessary, but if she had not been there, would anything really have changed? You know what I mean? That would have been a great scene to incorporate, like, "Oh, here's how smart the women were, saving everybody's hides," you know, like, coming through in the 11th minute because you didn't think things through, Potassier. So your wife has to do it. Like, I'm
Yeah.
all for more feminine representation in movies, it's much needed, but, I mean, come on, it was right there. The source material was right there, and you didn't do that. Maybe they cut it for time or something. You can hope. We'll give Disney the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, no, I agree. Definitely, Vidina has a few moments in the book where she really shines, so I definitely would have liked to see that in the movie. I think we super briefly get her, she manages to kind of smooth things over with the Americans at one point, I think, but yeah, you're right, she doesn't really have a lot to do. And yeah, this whole part is pretty accurate to real life, so the local Volkssturm troops show up, the local militia, and they're like, "What do you want us to do?" And he's like, you should be concerned that the stores are gonna be looted by these refugees, so you should guard the stores. And actually, you should go and guard the school at the end of the village, coincidentally, at the absolute far end of the village from where the Americans are, and he's just, like, trying to prevent at every turn, like, an actual, like, outburst of fighting because he doesn't want anything to happen to the horses, and, he doesn't want any more people to get killed either because, like, what's the point at this point? And there's one part where he's been told to set up roadblocks, and he doesn't do that because he's like, "Well, why?" And so these, like, local Nazi officials come through and they're like, "Why haven't you set up the roadblocks?" And he's like, "Well, I heard the guns stop, so I assumed that our guys were gonna have to move around, and I didn't wanna prevent them from doing that. So, like, I'm ready to set up roadblocks, but, like, I haven't set them up yet." And, so they were like, "Okay, yeah, okay, yeah, I vibe with that decision." So, yeah, he was really just flying by the seat of his pants trying to prevent some last minute fighting.
Just playing dumb enough to get by.
Yeah, exactly, and you know what? He's standing in the room with these Nazi officials, it's like, they could pull out a gun and shoot him right there if they think he's not following orders, so he's definitely not out of the woods.
Yeah.
Pulaski must quickly prepare a performance of the dancing horses for General George Patton, played by John Larch, and he's, like, the Pattonest Patton to ever Patton,
No, no, he maybe better than the Patton movie, Patton. He's so deadpan and already 5,000% done with your shit. Like,
Yeah, 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 they're gonna do this performance for Patton because they know he's, like, a big horse guy, and they figure if they do this performance for him, they can secure his protection for the riding school, which, protection also means we get money for food, which is crucial. We get money for, all kinds of different stuff. We can make sure that we can keep the horses safe. And, yeah, they also want his assistance in retrieving the Lipizzaner mares, which are caught behind the demarcation line in Czechoslovakia. So, as we talked about kind of right at the beginning, a whole bunch of these horses had been sent to Czechoslovakia, and now they're behind this line where, in the closing days of the war, the Western powers and the Soviets had kind of divvied everything up. So right now, Czechoslovakia is behind this line where technically, like, that belongs to the Russians. And so, yeah, so he's assisted in his efforts to put on this show for Patton by his wife, as well as his loyal sidekick Otto, played by Eddie Albert, and some friendly Americans, including Major Hoffman, played by James Franciscus.
I have a question. Is Major Hoffman the cute-looking American that we get in this movie?
yes, yes. He's
Excellent.
he's the cute one who I actually think maybe is the best actor besides John Lurch of the movie. Like, I thought he didn't overplay the American cowboy stereotype. I liked him a lot.
It felt kind of sincere from him as an actor. I felt it.
Yeah, I think he was just quite frankly thrilled to be part of it. Like, he was just happy to
Yeah.
be there.
Yeah, for sure. I read this book, obviously, and the movie kind of conflates these two separate occurrences, which I understand why they did that to, streamline it and make it make sense for kids and stuff. But so on the one hand, Patton did see a performance of the Dancing Horses as directed by Podolsky, which Podolsky used as a vehicle for asking for American protection for the horses. But on the other hand, it was not Patton's idea to rescue the remaining horses in Czechoslovakia, and he was aware of it, but he was not directly involved. The officer who did end up carrying it out had brought it up with Patton, and Patton was like, "You can do whatever you want, but if shit goes sideways, I did not put my name on this." So,
Right.
yeah. So separately, in Czechoslovakia, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer named Colonel Walter Holters turned himself into the Americans and agreed to provide information against the Soviets in exchange for a promise of rescue for the Lipizzaners and other horses at Hostau, which is what the stud farm was called in Czechoslovakia. So this was literally just the guy who loved horses so much that he was like, "I'm willing to turn myself in and not give you information about my country, but I will pass on everything I know about the Soviets." And so subsequently, these two Wehrmacht officers, Hubert Radowski, who was the director of the stud farm at Hostau, and Rudolf Lessing, who was the army veterinarian stationed there, made the rescue decision to work with American Colonel Hank Reed to remove the horses to Germany under American protection, knowing that it was a matter of weeks or days before their country capitulated to the Allies and the Russians arrived. The Russians were known for, if they couldn't make use of the horses, if the horses were uncooperative, they would shoot them, and quite often they would eat them because the Soviet army frequently suffered from supply line issues. So these men acted in defiance of orders to save the horses under their care. And then Reed, in turn, directed a group of 70 men to make an incursion into Czechoslovakia in the closing days of the war. They faced sporadic German opposition. They faced Czech partisan opposition when they tried to bring the horses over the border. And they kind of briefly occupied the stud farm, and then they were able to move the horses behind American lines.
I think what needs to be drilled home is that there was no doubt that these horses were going to die at the Russian hands, and if not for feeding the troops, where this part were severely starved. It was because these horses were not trained to do anything except the art of hot a cold dressage. They couldn't pull cannons, they couldn't pull heavy equipment. They were unmade for it. They would have broken down and they would have been shot. And so it was a genuine fear that we were going to be looking at a mass extinction of the rest of these horses if they had fallen into Russian hands, which I think they downplay a little bit, maybe not to like be all, hey, the Soviet army kind of sucked, you know what I mean? But like it was not a we're worried about this happening. It's they will be decimated if they fall into the Soviet Union hands.
Again, it's a Disney movie, so I think that's also part of why they didn't hammer that
Right.
home.
Can't bring it too real. Can't scare the
Yeah.
kid.
Imagine when you're a kid and you just hear that the Russians are gonna eat the horses.
I mean, I would have been unconsolable.
I feel like the German intelligence man would have had a better deal with the Americans anyway than the Soviets. I think he would have had a very hard time surviving being in Soviet hands. So I think he made a good deal.
Well, that whole kind of, we'll call it subplot of the book, even though it was really something that happened, was pretty interesting because it was him and a bunch of other intelligence officers who were holed up in like a villa, I guess. And so he came down to the Americans and he was like, look, I'll surrender myself and my buddies will also surrender. But we need to make it look like we didn't surrender. And so the Americans went up there and had like a fake firefight. They brought all the guys out of the house and then they like fired at it a bunch with a machine gun and they launched a couple of mortars over there and so that these intelligence guys could point at it and be like, "Well, we fought. Like, what do you want? The Americans overwhelmed us with their superior numbers."
Running theme of the military part of this movie is everybody's just half-assing their job to try to get to the end.
Literally, everyone is just like, "Guys, why are we still doing this?"
So Petan is almost characteristically hard to read in this entire movie. So when he's watching the performance, you can't really tell if he likes it or not. So Podolsky's like, he might not acquiesce to my request to help. But Petan does agree to help. I think he tells his aide to fix it. That's also when he notes that there are 2,000 Allied POWs there maintaining the horses who should also be rescued, so there's like a double incentive for him to go and do it.
Podolsky goes with Patton and his men to rescue the horses, and this is the part they zhuzhed up a little, but they gotta streamline it a little. The Americans propose a plan to the local SS unit. If they'll surrender to the Americans will get them out of Czechoslovakia and away from the advancing Russians. But then an errant unit of SS troops ambush the Americans at the Czech border anyway. Dun dun dun. And then there's a big battle scene, but the Americans are ultimately victorious.
This battle scene was so confusing.
It was really confusing.
What was going on?
Well, they were severely downplaying because, apparently they ran into several SS skirmish sorta units and, I think there weren't too many casualties, maybe like 3 to 10, but there were some because there were still pockets, of SS resistance who kinda were on the same bandwidth of, "Hey, guys, we're just trying to, like, ease into the end of the war here," like, they were still under orders to fight, and they did. And so, again, Disney movie, they can't show something like that. But the remake, they really need those skirmish scenes, that's what I'm wanting to see.
Yeah, and I need Colonel Reed to get some credit in the remake, and I need the Wehrmacht officers to get, a little bit of screen time as well. I would love to get the real story.
I at this point had lost interest in the end of the movie. I was just like checking out at this point. I just couldn't stay focused. I was on my phone. Even though this was where the actual World War II stuff was happening, I was just like, can it be done already?
I will say I was folding laundry or something, and I briefly looked down, and then I looked up, and they were in a combat scene, and I was like, "Whoa!" I was like, "When did this happen?" Like, I really was not following, which could be a me problem because I was, as I said, doing something else at the same time. But I was like, "Okay."
I mean, you get the gist. You don't really need to go back and figure out what's going on.
After they win the battle, they go to the horses and there's a large herd of them. And these are not just Lipizzaners, but they don't have time to kind of pick out what the Lipizzaners are, so they just take all of them. And then there's much celebration when the missing horses are returned. I did like that they were in the stables at the mansion, at, like, the manor house of the countess, and they were like, "Wait, because these horses are all the mares, all the stallions are at the house." And then they're like, "The stallions can hear their mares," and it was really kind of funny.
Something about, like, "Your girlfriends are on the way," or something like that, like, typical
Yeah.
typical American comedic effect.
The real life bummer of this is that a lot of the horses that were at that stud farm had been appropriated by the Germans from Poland and Czechoslovakia and other occupied countries. And it was tough at the end of the war because so many people had been displaced or killed. And so it was really difficult to find who the original owners of the horses were. Additionally, quite often the Germans didn't want to make it clear that they were just whole cloth stealing horses. And so the paper trail wasn't necessarily that fleshed out. And so a lot of these horses ended up being taken back to the US. And in later years, countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia were like, hey, what are the odds we can get some of our horses back? And that never happened. And so that really was detrimental to the horse breeding programs in those countries. As well, well, a lot of the horses, when they got to the States, because of this kind of shoddy paper trail by the Germans, they weren't allowed to be used for breeding for horse racing. So a lot of them just got sold off to various owners for various purposes. Yeah, kind of a little bit of a bummer as an end note on what happened to the rest of those horses.
Can you imagine just, like, going to some horse auction and there's, like, a $1,000,000 stud from, the Polish royal stables there, and you're like, "Well, he looks pretty good. I'll make him my kid's horse." Like, that's just so wild. I mean, helping Americans were helping, but not really because you don't get any of your stuff back. It's just bizarre.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 10 years later, when the Lipizzaners stallions at last return to their home in Vienna, they give a special performance for the school's 220th anniversary, and that's what you spend the last 10 or so minutes of the movie watching.
We stayed made a choice about either doing the show for Patton in the movie or this last one because it's so long. I was like, do I need to see two almost identical performances in a movie that's already so long?
I mean, if you're a horse girl, yes. If you're not, then no.
Reading the book too, I feel like I got a lot more of a sense of it literally takes years to train horses to do that, and, like, the rider would choose their horse and, like, that's your horse, and you train your horse for years and years, and it just reaches a point where you're almost, like, telepathically communicating with your horse, like, not actually, but, like, that's what it's like. You barely have to even move, and your horse, like, understands what you want it to do, and, like, just the amount of time and effort that goes into that, and, like, I didn't know that watching the movie because I don't know a lot about horses, so I was like, "Oh, yeah, that looks cool," but I didn't understand, like, how much of an art form it was.
The whole goal of it is to execute these movements while making it look like the horse is doing it on its own and there's no rider interference at all. Which, as someone who rides competitive dressage, which is, it's a watered down version of this classical dressage, it's super hard. I'm a terrible rider, and I've been doing it for 10 years. So the fact that these riders, they get assigned one stallion, and they take the stallion up through the levels of training to reach the point of doing these just incredibly advanced moves. I mean, the scenes where the horses are, like, jumping up in the air and kicking out and then landing on all 4 feet, it's the equivalent of, like, the top ballet dancers in the world. These horses are so athletic. It's just insane, and to reach that level of dexterity and agility, it literally takes 10 years. But what is cool is that in all of the riding scenes in this movie, they were actually the Spanish riding school riders, and Pataski himself is in, one, if not both performances. They say you can see him, but I can't pick him out because 'cause they're like, "He's on the Lipizzaner with a slightly grayer mane and tail," and I'm like, "I'm not even good enough to pick that out," but he's in there, he choreographed all of the riding scenes, so that was cool that they got, some representation in there since it's all about them.
Definitely.
And that is the end of the movie. We do also have some notes, so I will hand it back over to you, Laura, for your notes.
I think I had mentioned most of these things previously, but again, just to sort of reiterate the fact that at the end of the day, this whole story was about 5 to 10 horse boys, who, like, this all happened because Patton loved horses, Colonel Reed loved horses, the German officer who surrendered loved horses, and There's something sorta innocent about that, in the midst of all the stories that come out of World War II, and some of them are just heartbreaking and some of them are inspiring. There's a level of sorta, I don't know, like, almost magical innocence to the fact that this entire thing happened because 5 to 10 men loved horses so much that they made a whole mission about rescuing these unicorn-like animals past the line of demarcation from literally getting eaten, which, I think maybe it was the bottom line of that story, which made this movie so appealing, to a child, because you got that part of it if you didn't get anything else, like, that was the underlying detail is, like,
Yeah.
I am a horse fanatic, and all of these people were horse fanatics, and therefore Operation Cowboy was successful.
Even the fact that the Germans were fortunate to surrender to Colonel Reed, who had been a literal horse riding cavalry officer before he, came overseas, and, obviously the Americans didn't at this point have cavalry units anymore, but he was a big horse guy, and, like, they were just fortunate that they encountered this man who, had a long history with horses.
Yeah, it was almost serendipitous, Like, it makes you wonder if it was anybody else. If it was any of the other generals besides Patton. Eisenhower didn't give a shit about horses as far as I knew.
Yeah.
But Patton was a cavalry officer, like an actual cavalry officer. He went to the Olympics for the pentathlon, which had horse jumping in it back in 1912, and he bred and raced steeplechasers. He was widely renowned as one of the most, revered horsemen of the military scene. That's why he wore boots. He wore riding boots for his entire military career when he
Yeah.
bucked the standard uniform and wouldn't take his boots off.
Yeah, Colonel Reed consulted on the movie, and he was asked why he had decided to save the horses, and he said, "We were so tired of death and destruction, we wanted to do something beautiful." Which is like
Mm,
it's like, at this point, an older man saying this. I think that really boils it down to its essence.
yeah.
You have another quote, that you sent to me. I don't know if you can find it quickly, but it just made me so emotional. Can you look it up?
Well, I have a quote from Patton about the situation where he was talking about why he agreed to rescue the horses. It's probably wrong to let any highly developed art, however fastuous, perish from the earth, and which arts are fastuous depends on the point of view. To me, the high schooling of horses is more interesting and beautiful than painting and music.
Aw.
This is from Stoic Patton, who had no emotion whatsoever, but don't threaten the horses now, or he's gonna have to get involved.
Yeah, and Patton's such a fascinating historical figure because I mean, he died in, like, November, December of 1945. He did not long survive the war, so I think that he just looms so large in the popular imagination, but we also, like we didn't get his war memoirs or anything like that, so
And at the end
We
of the
need
day, he was just a horse crazy boy.
we need to do the Patton movie. We haven't done the Patton movie yet.
And that
yeah,
would be
I've been seeing it come up in, like, lists of World War II movies. I'm like, "Yeah, I'll have to pick up, like, a biography or something at some point."
Yeah.
But this is the quote from the book that you were talking about. This is from the afterword because the person who wrote this book did quite a lot of, like, interviews with the descendants of, like, Colonel Reed and, like, a lot of these other people who are, like, major figures, and there was this guy named James Harold Pittman who was one of the Americans who was involved and was killed during the war, and so the author writes, "In the course of writing this book, I had many touching conversations with the descendants of these World War II soldiers, but the words that I believe marked me the most were those of the son of James Harold Pittman, who was only a baby when his father was killed in the war. He said, 'I hope you can bring him alive again.' I have tried."
she is.
I don't know why that hit me so hard, but the "I have tried" is such an honest,
Oh,
humble thing to say at the end of a book.
it
Yeah.
has such big "in the company of heroes, Dick Winters" energy. My goodness.
I know. So just they need to remake this movie. They need to put all these characters in there. I want to feel something, I want to feel some emotional resonance.
It's a great story, right? Like, the story itself is so cool, and they gotta step up their game. I think it needs to leave Disney hands. Quite frankly, they need to sell that, which I don't know, maybe they own most of the world at this point, so maybe they could buy up another company to do it, but it has such great potential.
I say we just write the screenplay. I feel like we can do it between us, and then we can submit it.
We might
We
be
can
sitting on
send
a
it
million-dollar idea here.
That's right.
we'll send it to Bruce McKenna, and then he'll pass it on, and it'll be great.
Call Spielberg, call Hanks, we have an idea.
we have to rate this movie, but before we do, I would like to remind everyone that you can follow us wherever you get your podcast and rate us 5 stars. You can send this episode to a friend to save a Lipizzaner horse, please. Thank you. And now we'll get into the rating system, I guess. What do we want to rate this movie out of? We could do stoic pattern looks out of 10.
Oh, my God, expression.
Right. Mark, these stoic pattern expressions out of 10 would you rate this movie?
I would rate this movie, I don't know, 6.2 stoic pattern expressions out of 10. I was a
That
little.
is much higher than I thought you were gonna shoot. I think you're being too nice. It's okay.
It's because we've talked about it now, and it's made me appreciate it more. This always happens to me. Like, when I was watching it, I would have given it a 4.5, but now, having talked about it, there's some good stuff in there. So, it gets a 6.2. It's not bad. It just could be so much better. So, I like the music, by the way. I do love a good overture at the start of a movie, and it's very Disney. I would like it to be a little less Disney, but other than that, I don't hate a horse movie. So, that's why it gets a 6.2.
This was the only Disney movie with a World War II backdrop that's been made so far.
I mean, thank God, because we don't want Disney to make any more World War II movies, do we?
I think they learned their lesson.
You're like, wow, it's really hard to make a movie set during World War II that doesn't have any killing in it.
Right.
I mean, the closest other thing we got from Disney is The Shepherd. That's kind of World War II related.
Yeah. Tenuously, I guess, yeah.
World War II adjacent.
How about you, Alora? What would you rate this movie? How many pattern expressions out of 10?
I mean, from a nostalgic point of view, the child in me gives it a solid 6.5 stoic expressions. From a filmmaking standpoint, I'd say maybe 4. It's really not, the script is not great. And if I had not grown up with this movie, I don't think I would have sought this out. I think I would like to read the books around it, though, especially the newest one by, oh, what's his name? Mark Felton said it had a whole bunch of uncovered information about maybe the socio-political stuff, that we were craving originally, and so I would like to read that and see if that would be better, but, I think from a filmmaking standpoint, it's probably 4 out of 10. I think it's a great story. I think it needs to be redone. So I would say, 8 out of 10 for the story itself.
I feel like we're kind of on the same level here with appreciation of the story versus movie making. It's so different. But that's
Mhm.
why I adjusted my rating to be slightly higher, but that's just the appreciation of the story, not the actual movie.
Yeah. Super solid premise for sure. And I went into it knowing that it was a Disney movie made in the era of like, I don't know, Mary Poppins and like all these like movies that I also watched when I was a kid. And so I didn't have like super high expectations. And so yeah, I mean I didn't mind it. It's definitely a kids movie. I think I'll also give it a 4 stoic pattern expressions out of 10. I did like getting the chance to research because I learned so much about the German breeding programs and like their prioritization of horses. And it was just such an interesting, like, reading about how in 1942, the Americans were like, yeah, we're actually getting rid of cavalry units. So we're not going to do the horse thing anymore. And like, meanwhile, horses were still such a priority for other armies. And just one of many ways in which World War II was this era of like, profound change, technological change especially. Getting to read about the chaotic nature of the closing days of World War II when there's these really kind of nebulous, fluid boundaries and people are they know what they're supposed to be doing, but there's also, like, not a lot of authority around to ensure that that's what actually ends up happening, and sometimes that is for the bad, but sometimes that's for the good as we see in this movie, so, yeah, super interesting research topic, and, if you wanted to throw this movie on for a kid who was a real horse kid, they would probably really enjoy it, so there is that.
Well, I did also like that it covered Eastern European towards the end of the war, I don't think that's a geographical location that I myself knew a whole lot about just because it's not mentioned. I mean, beyond maybe going up into Poland and discovering some of the concentration camps and stuff like that. Like, yeah, I didn't know anything about the sorta Bosnia-Herzegovina kinda situation of the war at all. So, for that to just be the backdrop for this entire story, I thought was really interesting, and it would prompt me to want to seek out more information about it.
Yeah.
we've come to the part of this podcast where we ask you, Alora, if you have any books you want to recommend. I know we didn't give you this in advance. If you don't have any, that's fine.
Let's see. Let me look up who this novel. Okay, so right now, I'm glad you asked this question because for 2026, my goal is to finish 10 books, which may seem low to some people, but I haven't finished more than like 2 books in the past 5 years. So I'm really aiming my sights high. And the one I just got is The Tattooist of Auschwitz by Heather Morris. I think they made maybe a TV series out of it, if not a
Yeah, they
movie.
made a series, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm gonna read the book first because I always like to read the book and then get mad about how the film adaptation is shit. So, yeah, that's my into February reading. I'm gonna bum myself out. I know it's gonna break my heart, but I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've read that book. It is a huge bummer, but I mean, still a good read.
Mhm.
Are you reading anything, Sam, you want to tell us about?
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned a couple weeks ago that I was gonna bring this book on vacation, and I did. I'm almost done. I have less than 100 pages left. It's called Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham, The Untold Story of the World's Greatest Nuclear Disaster. It's really good. I mean, if you've ever wanted to know more about Chernobyl, this was really well written, really compelling. I did at one point I was sitting by the pool in the Dominican reading this book, and I just got up, and my friend was like, "Oh, where are you going?" I was like, "I am so mad at the Soviet government right now for how they're handling this. I need to walk it off." Highly recommend.
I am surprisingly also reading a book. I mentioned this book the other day. It's called Atlantic Furies. It's by Mitch Gillies, and it's about the women pilots of the early 20th century who were trying to cross the Atlantic, and it's amazing. It's so interesting because obviously everyone knows Lindbergh as the big flyboy. There were so many women trying to do something that they were not supposed to do because they were women. So they were kind of struggling to get to even do this, but it's really interesting so far, and I can't wait to read more. And I've also picked up some more books by Mitch Gillies because we are really interested in talking to her about her World War II books. And she's got a few, so that's coming
Excellent.
up at some point this year.
That's gonna be great.
I hope so. I think that's it for this episode. Alora, thank you so much for being on. This was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me. This was a lot of fun.
And thank you everybody else for listening once again this week. As I already said, you can follow us wherever you get your podcast and rate us 5 stars. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, or you can visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com, for more info. I don't know what I'll put on there about this movie, but I'm sure it'll be interesting, so go check that out. And we'll see you next week.
Bye.